more effective strategies than are in existence at the moment are very often rejected on the grounds that they can be challenged on some aspects of it, and therefore they're rejected in favour of maintaining the status quo, which if checking it out on the same grounds would have been dismissed even more emphatically. Weekly pension equivalence, WPE, I coined that term. In other words, the weekly pension equivalent is about £70, so that one could say that a reasonable seat at the Royal Opera House was WPE, one weekly pension equivalent. I think it would help people to relate to the disparity between the incomes of the rich and the poor, when one can see, for instance, that, let's say, a pensioner without other sources of income or means of support is the one, and yet somebody in the city, the WPE is 258 or something like that. I think it would help government to introduce policies with that higher level of understanding of its relevance than the measures that are deployed at present. Those measures, I think, are heavily distorted by another way in which both all the political parties and indeed government in power discuss the issue of the disparity of income by saying that, well, one group has had a 2% rise in income by virtue of the government policy, so I don't think it right for other groups to say, but you've offered us less, or you're proposing to introduce a lower than 2% increase in our earnings. And of course the explanation for this is very simple. 2% of a judge's income is a huge sum of money, whereas 2% of a factory floor worker or a nurse is far, far lower. But to equate the two by calling them both 2% just distorts one's understanding. And indeed, when one goes into a shop, one doesn't pay with percentages of one's income, one pays with money, and that money is a far better measure to arrive at fair decisions about how people have got to live on their income. Another way of enabling people to understand the role that they have to play in relation to their own income in order to stay in the black is to do what the Chancellor does each year in having his annual budget, which is the basis for establishing what is likely to be the revenue available to the government to dispense in various areas of its departments, and then to see how best to dispense these for those departments. What I've suggested is that individuals can do the equivalent, and as far as I know, nobody does, except myself, but in order to try this out. And I've found that it is invaluable. What you simply do, and it's not difficult to get the headings, is to look at determine what your typical expenditure is on food, on gas, on electricity, on your holidays and so on, and then to relate that to what your income is, whether it's from salary or pension or from other sources, and in that way to attempt to balance the two against each other. The benefits are wider than would be at first appreciated, because what it does allow for is seeing the need to adjust policies so that one doesn't come out in the red, but more so than that, it is invaluable experience in terms of the allocation of money, seeing how that changes over time, and to enable one make one better able to learn from experience year on year, where one fails and one one incurs or has expenses that one hadn't anticipated, to see the need for a contingency fund to cover those unexpected charges, and then to see the extent to which that contingency could be lowered or could be raised for people determined to, as the Chancellor attempts to do, live within the national budget. In the last 20 years or so, a near consensus has developed amongst the scientific community that climate change is not only occurring, but it is accelerating, and that poses real problems for policymakers attempting to respond to the challenge of climate change. Given that these scientists have calculated what is the capacity of the global atmosphere to absorb more or additional burning of fossil fuels with carbon emissions, one could reasonably, I think, say that we are now in a position to say that that quantity is finite if we are not to exceed the 2-degree rise in above the pre-industrial revolution level. And then the question comes, so it's finite, how is it to be shared out? I think it would be very difficult indeed to argue that it should be shared out on an unequal basis across the world's population, and therefore one can arrive very simply at the amount, the volume of further emissions that can be released, and simply to divide it by the world's population. That certainly would bring one down to earth in realizing how strongly in contrast that is to the wider and wider adoption of energy-intensive lifestyles, not only in this country and in Europe, but across the world's population. And one can see in China and India and so on the intention, and not surprising intention, of their populations wishing to emulate the lifestyles of us in the affluent West. It obviously doesn't work. So what do we do about that? 25 years ago, I put forward the proposition that there is only one way of dealing with that, and it stems from the fact that as a child I lived through food rationing and clothing rationing during World War II, the concept of fair shares, where there is a fixed quantity to share out. How do you share it out? As it was the case with food rationing, on an equal basis, each person was given a ration book which had the coupons to exchange at the grocer when one bought butter or cheese or meat or whatever. And in that way, it was seen to be very fair indeed, and there were no demonstrations in Trafalgar Square saying no, money should be the way in which we share these things out. If you just have to spend more money in order to buy the food that you wish, overlooking the fact that were one to adopt that policy, one would be tripping over people who died of starvation because they couldn't afford to pay for the food that was going up in price. So fair rationing in the case of food was widely accepted as a reasonable and perhaps only way of sharing out the limited amount of food that was available, given the closure of the food routes from Canada, Australia, New Zealand and so on. Applying that concept of rationing to carbon emissions is the way, in my view, the way of going about it. Of course, fought hard over again because people suggest that taxation and pricing is a better way of meeting. It's the better way for the market to work. Well, in this instance, the market can't work without having hugely damaging effects on those who can't afford to pay for it. So people in the third world, let alone people, poorer people in this country, people in the third world would just, if one were to go about it by, in effect, trying to burn off the demand by ever-rising prices, poorer people just would not be able to heat their homes in the winter, let alone to travel by motorised means, and certainly flying would be ruled out altogether because of the costs entailed in delivering targets on carbon emission reductions. So what I proposed was the introduction of an annual carbon allowance for each individual, with a smaller allowance, of course, for children. And what that would result in is people being given this annual ration, which would be deducted when one paid for petrol or even train travel, which is itself energy intensive. And also for fuel for the home. Later on, that rationing would also cover commodities that one bought, dependent upon the emissions that were entailed in their manufacture, like fridges, freezers, cars, and so on. That would act as a way of not only delivering on the target, because the ration would be a function of the delivery of the target, but it would also be a way of promoting carbon thriftiness in life. The proposition included the concept of having trading in it. Objections have been raised to that on the grounds that, of course, wealthier people would be able to afford to buy the surplus units of poorer people, for instance, who didn't have a car and never flew, which would take such a chunk of the allowance. That is, however, easily got over, because the allowance is going to have to be reduced steadily from, let's say, the average at which it started, which could be the level of average emissions at present, down to as close to zero as possible, as soon as possible. In those circumstances, even the wealthy would not be able to buy the surplus of people living on much lower units of fossil fuels, because they would be getting down to a basic level simply for the most essential of fossil fuel use that can be contemplated. But the overriding consideration in this instance is to ensure that the targets are met. We cannot just go on believing or assuming that if we go on burning fossil fuels, it's something that can be slowed down or stopped just by switching off a button, because carbon emissions accumulate in the atmosphere for well over 100 years. So things can only get worse if we go on, as we obviously will be doing. Things can only get worse as time goes on, and therefore the challenge rises and is getting more difficult. That's why we need to address this issue as an absolute matter of urgency. So obviously, where does the responsibility for introducing carbon rationing lie? Well, the obvious is people are not going to voluntarily adopt a system of limiting their use of fossil fuels simply because they know how damaging, informed of how damaging it is, or because they are encouraged by some sort of subsidy to limit it. The only way is for it to be made, not in the hope that it can be done on a voluntary basis, but it would have to be done on a mandatory basis, and only governments can do this, introducing the carbon rationing and going through the processes and procedures that thereby would be entailed. Environmental protection is another area which I have studied to see ways and means whereby current policies are having adverse effects rather than beneficial effects on the way in which things are done. An area that could be cited in this instance is that related to the subsidy given to fossil fuel companies which are exploring for more fossil fuels, or indeed subsidy given to subsidy given to railway companies. From the perspective of the general public, who maybe are not as well informed as they should be on the subject, it stands to reason that if you give subsidy to rail companies, you can reasonably expect that fares would be lowered, and everybody thinks that's fine because what it would do is to enable people to travel longer distances, to travel by a form of transport that is better than travel by car, and generally in much more relaxed conditions. The problem is that insufficient attention is given to the downside of this process. It is absolute anathema to think that at this stage in history, when we are so aware of the damaging effects of climate change, that we should be subsidising forms of travel which enable, in fact, almost encourage people to travel longer distances, albeit that rail is more efficient. The fact is that it is still dependent upon the burning of fossil fuels just at a time when we know that we have got to absolutely minimise that process, and indeed develop lifestyles that are as local as possible and that do not depend on the use of fossil fuels. Moreover, it should be borne in mind that rail travel only accounts for 1% of all journeys, and a far higher proportion of travel is undertaken by those who aren't really so much in the need of subsidy, in other words, the social groups A and B. The consequence of the subsidy is that people choose and then depend upon more geographically spread lifestyles where, in the main, car travel is seen to be the only realistic way of getting around on a daily basis, let alone the whole issue of support for rail travel. And that again is an instance where the change of government policy has led to an intensification of the need for fossil fuels as part and parcel of daily lifestyles. I mean, to a degree, it's the equivalent of obliging people to have single glazing rather than double glazing. All these examples indicate that we really do need new measures of success from the perspective of taking account also not only of the private interest, which, as I say, ignores very often the wider public interest, but also of that wider public interest. It does represent quite a challenge to social scientists, social innovators, to come up with ways and means that promote the incorporation of those wider considerations into personal decision making.